Good morning. Before we get started, I just want to point you to the blog on grandstreet.wordpress.com. There's a blog post, a video about the UFO at the Temple Mount. So, you guys want to check that out. Before we get started, I had a special request from my father-in-law, Ronald McElroy, to give birthday wishes to his wife, Fran, who would have turned 62 today. Fran passed from us 4 years ago, and I wanted to give a little bit of a service for her in her honor. If anybody at this time would like to speak about her, raise your hands and I'll bring you up one by one. Pastor Jessica.
It would have been my grandmother's birthday. Except I didn't refer to her as grandma, I referred to her as Nana. And I miss her dearly. Me and her used to talk about books, music, pretty much anything. She asked me every time, well, did you get the new this book, the new that book, this one's really cool, why don't you try this one? Yeah, it was always a conversation piece with us. And I still remember the last time I talked to her, and it was Christmas of that year. She asked me what I got, and I told her I got, clothes and stuff like that, and she said, I'll meet you later, kid. That's the last thing she said. And I love you. Just didn't believe that on the 28th that I would hear that Granny was gone. I still use the crocheting needles that she used. My grandfather gave me them. And I'm using them to this day to make a blanket for my mom and my dad. And I also wear a ring that she had. It's on the necklace that I wear. And it has her initials on it, Frances McElroy. And I still remember her name to this day, and I always will. I miss you, Grandma, and I love you.
Does anybody else wish to speak?
Actually, to tell you the truth, she was my stepmom. And I came to know her in the 70s from a very sudden thing my dad says to me, she's going to be a part of my life, and she's now part of yours. And I loved her like no other person in the world. To me, she was not my stepmom, she was my mom. She was everything to me. I could call her anytime I wanted and tell her, Mom, I got a problem. And she would sit right there and she says, okay, kid, sit down, let's figure it out. When I found out that I was pregnant for our second child, she turned around and she says to me, okay, she says, we're going to go through this again. And I'm like, oh, great, fabulous, terrific. Mom's going to be there. Unfortunately, shortly after we found out that the baby was topic because I was rushed to the hospital. No one knew that the baby was growing the right way until suddenly we got there and all hell broke loose. Mom was there for my husband. Dad was there. She done everything. She made sure everybody was there and everyone was helping everyone. That's the kind of person she was. You could call her, you could tell her anything, and she loved you to death. She was more than anything in the world, and I miss her. Happy birthday, Mom.
On behalf of Ronald McElroy, Darlene Mattice, Tabitha Lynn Wilcox, myself, and Jessica, we want to wish Fran a happy 62nd birthday. And if she had time to say it, I'm sure she would have said something like this. When I must leave you for a little while, please do not grieve and shed wild tears. and hug your sorrow to you through the years. But start out bravely with a gallant smile, and for my sake and my name, live on and do all things the same. Feed not your loneliness on empty days, but fill each waking hour in useful ways. Reach out your hand in comfort and in cheer, and in turn will comfort you and hold you near. And never, never be afraid to die, for I am waiting for you in the sky. At this time, as we say, on behalf of the family and friends of Frances McElroy, happy birthday. We're going to have a moment of silent prayer in her honor. Thank you. Through 32. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai, the Jew, gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Absinarus in the words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed sessions, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther enjoined upon the Jews as they laid down for themselves and for their descendants with regard to their lamentation. The command of Queen Esther fixed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. In chapter 10, King Ahasuerus laid tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to King Ahasuerus, who was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brethren, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. Reading this passage is sort of like coming into a theater near the end of a movie. We kind of know how it all turns out, but are really fuzzy on what's going on. This morning we are focusing on Esther, a godly woman who is powerfully used by God, and the passage we read gives us the outcome, the results of what transpired in her life. Like giving away the secret of who done it in a murder mystery, our reason for reading these verses is to clarify that God used Esther, and through her saved the Jewish nation living in the Persian Empire. We want to look at this morning is how all this happened, to give some background on Esther's circumstances and how she was able to be used by God, how she lived in the circumstances of her life. Her godly character is really the example that we need to apply to our lives in the circumstances that we live in. In 600 BC, Esther's family was captured, along with a large number of her nation, carried away and exiled into the Persian Empire. They were subjugated people living in a foreign land and culture, a Jewish diaspora. Given the opportunity, many of the Jews had later returned to Jerusalem, but many families, like Esther's, had elected to stay, even through odors. They preferred the prosperity and luxury of Persia. This is like the Americans today. We could all reparate to America, but we don't. Why? Our lives are here, our family, friends, and our livelihood. Esther is an orphan raised by her uncle Mordecai, who is an official at the king's place. Esther is young and very beautiful. She is patriotic and a godly woman of clear judgment, magnificent self-control, and capable of the noblest sacrifice. The timing of the events of the book of Esther take place between 484 and 473 BC. Ahasuerus is the king of Persia, one of the greatest empires of all time. His kingdom includes 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. And King Ahasuerus, whose name means victorious, had even knocked on the door of Greece and was barely rebuffed from conquering there. Ahasuerus is a tyrant, a cruel man of uncertain judgment, great tempers, wild passions, and extremes. He was a man who obeyed the baser instincts of his nature. He was a slave of alcohol, food, passion, and pride. It is in Ahasuerus' capital city of Susa that Esther lived. In the royal palace there is a great turmoil. Queen Vashti, a woman of excellent modesty, dignity, and strong determination, had been dethroned for failing to appear naked before the king's drunken party guests. All over the empire, beauty pageants are being held to find virgins to replace Queen Vashti. At court there is intrigue. Plots are being formulated to kill the king, who, by the way, was later murdered by one of his chamberlains and a captain of his guard, Haman. An ancient version of Hitler is the second in command of the empire. Because of a dispute with Mordecai, Haman is formulating a plan to massacre the Jews and blame the king. We know because we read the end of the story that Esther won the beauty contest and became the queen. And we know God placed her in a position of being the one person who could save her people from genocide. And despite overwhelmingly impossible circumstances, she was successful. The Jews were saved, Haman got hung, and Mordecai became the number one person of Persia. Difficult circumstances? Some would say impossible. Yet God brought victory. God used Esther. How? What did she do? What did she do that can be an example to us? In the circumstance of our life, overwhelming as they may seem, how can God use us? There are 3 lessons from Esther's life that I would like to highlight for you. Lesson 1 from Esther 2:19-23. One of the subplots in this book of Esther involves 2 of the king's eunuchs, Brighton and Teresh. It seems that they had a falling out with the king and were plotting to kill him. Mordecai overhears their plan and tells Queen Esther in chapter 2, we read that Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. Later in chapter 6, we read that Mordecai was richly rewarded by the king. In Esther's actions, there is tremendous lesson for humanity in us. Esther could have taken for herself all the credit for exposing the plot, but she never forgot her roots. Esther remembered her guardian, parent Mordecai. She obeyed him, she respected him, she gave him the credit which was due him. And as we read through the book of Esther, there are numerous occasions where Esther sought out Mordecai, his wisdom, counsel, and advice. Often when a person has moved up in the world and has achieved a position of power and eminence, too often they become forgetful, ashamed of anything which would remind them of where they have come from, where they should be humble. Because of God's gracious, they become proud. In the midst of difficult circumstances, we should never be too proud to ask for help from God or others. Too often we put on a mask and act like everything is okay. We can handle it. We hear people say, Nishadi yad paradok. And yet we go on suffering in silence. Well, mi lavi che. How is God going to bring real victory in our lives if we are too proud to ask Him for help? How can we as a church minister to anyone, demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ, which we are called and commanded to do, if we are all too proud to admit that we need help? We miss so much of what God has for us because we simply won't humble ourselves before Him. In the midst of difficult circumstances, regardless of our position or whatever image we think we need to maintain, we need to be vulnerable, transparent, and open to God's solutions and victories. In the lesson of prayer, which is part number 2, Esther is about to approach the king to petition for the life of her people. This is the one defining moment in her life. Like an Olympic athlete competing for the gold medal, she has been in training her whole life for this one moment. Her life and the life of her nation hung upon the results of this moment in time. Before she goes to the throne room, she sends word to Mordecai, chapter 4, verse 16, to gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. And neither nor will drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. But I will go to the king, though it against the law, and if I perish, I perish. In other words, put everything else aside, get the people together before God and pray. It is amazing how our lives are often changed by singular events, defined by one moment in time, and often as we feel as though those events just sort of happen to us, that they're random chance happenings that somehow we must continue through trusting that someone we are supposed to make the right choices and be able to triumph. Whatever the circumstances of our lives, these are already known to God. Even before we were born, even the Bible says, even before the creation of the earth, the circumstances of our lives, no matter how difficult, are already known to God. In prayer, we are never alone in the defining moments of our lives. Prayer places us humbly before God's throne, seeking His guidance, His solutions, His strength, following His plan for our lives. In prayer, the forces of our adversary, Satan, are kept at bay. In prayer, we can ask for God to act with the power of heaven on our behalf. In prayer, we can join with our brothers and sisters in Jesus to seek God's victories. And the third, the lesson of trust. Imagine the scene as Esther comes before King Xerxes. She stands adorned in her royal robes, there in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. And the king, this cruel, debased tyrant, is sitting on his royal throne opposite the entrance as Esther stands there. The crowd becomes silent, hushed. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter. So the silence is deafening, and the pause is awkward. What will King Xerxes do? Finally, King Xerxes stands his scepter. Esther has found favor in his sight. And as Esther pleads in the events which follows, as she pleads for the existence of her people, the king grants her request. Her people are spared from genocide, Haman is hung, and her uncle Mordecai, a Jew, becomes the number one man in Persia. Esther dared to risk death for her people, and so escaped dying with them. Her trust was in God. Before coming to the king, there was preparation. In humility, she admitted her need and sought godly counsel. In prayer, she committed her actions to God's will and keeping. In boldness, she stood before the mightiest man on earth, knowing that the strength of the Almighty God of creation was on her side. By her trust in God, God used her as an instrument of His providence for the working out of a glorious victory and a great deliverance for her nation. Often we are tempted to say, "Who am I?" And in reality, my circumstances are not like Esther's. But in reality, who was Esther? Until God in His providence placed her in a position to save a nation. History tells us of Martin Luther, a miner's son, who shook the world. Zwingli, the shepherd's son, who led the Reformation in Europe. Moody, the shoe salesman, who rocked 2 continents with his powerful preaching. David with his sling and stones against Goliath. And we could go on giving examples. In closing today, who are we in America, a nation always on the brink of extinction? A nation needing deliverance, a nation needing spiritual revival. Maybe our nation needs to see the example of Esther lived out in our lives today. Whatever the circumstance of our lives, whatever the difficulty, God can bring victory. Let us not seek to stand in our own pride, but instead let us humbly seek Him in prayer and move forward boldly at His leading. Now for our benediction, Pastor Jessica.
And as as our pastor pointed out, that Esther proved us to be bold and prideful and everything. Esther reminds me to always remember my family, where we came from, and what sacrifices we went through to get to where we are today. Because she remembered where she came from, what she was, and never forgot. And God praised her for that. And also, it also reminds me to to honor people who helped me truthfully. Mordecai went ahead and helped the king. He stopped the assassination plot on the king. He told them what they were going to do, and the king honored him. Took him a while, but he honored him. And that is the lesson I learned from Esther, is never forget your family and those who helped you. To love them and honor them and never forget. Amen.